March 9, 1945, 5:36 in the evening, Chamorro Standard Time, Northfield, Guam. Staff Sergeant Carl Barthold climbs aboard the B-29 Superfortress named Starduster and notices something fundamentally wrong with his aircraft. The gun turrets are still there, their distinctive bubble shapes breaking the bomber's smooth aluminum skin. But the twin 50 caliber machine guns that should bristle from the upper forward position have been removed. The lower forward turret sits empty. The aft dorsal guns are gone. Only the tail turret retains its weapons, two 50 caliber Brownings and a single 20mm cannon pointing rearward like the last sentries on an abandoned fortress. Barthold's crew has trained for months on the complex General Electric central fire control system, spending hundreds of hours learning to aim remotely controlled turrets from pressurized sighting stations scattered throughout the aircraft's fuselage. The technology represents millions of dollars in research and development, the most advanced defensive weapons system ever installed on a combat aircraft. And now, on the eve of the largest bombing mission in history, 334 B-29 seconds are flying into battle stripped of 60% of their defensive armament. The math behind this decision would determine whether 21st Bomber Command won or lost the air war against Japan. Every gun removed meant 200 pounds of weight savings. Every 1,000 rounds of ammunition left behind translated to 500 additional pounds of incendiary bombs. The total weight reduction per aircraft exceeded 3,000 pounds, enough to carry 12 additional clusters of M69 firebombs or extend the bomber's effective range by 500 miles at reduced altitude. But the crews boarding their aircraft on 3 islands across the Marianas understood the equation differently. Without their guns, they would face Japanese night fighters and anti-aircraft fire with only faith in their commanding general's calculations about enemy capabilities. If Curtis LeMay was wrong about Japanese defenses, 300 bombers would burn out of the sky over Tokyo while carrying nothing to fight back with except the tail gunner's solitary position. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The right blister gunner on Barthold's crew has already made his peace with what he believes will be his final mission. His B-4 bag sits packed in the center of his cot back in the Quonset hut, every possession arranged with the tidy precision of a man who expects someone else to sort through his belongings. Other gunners throughout the 21st Bomber Command share similar premonitions. They understand what the removal of their weapons means on a psychological level that transcends strategic calculation. The Air Force is sending them into battle deliberately weakened, trading their ability to defend themselves for the capacity to burn Tokyo to ash. The decision that stripped Starduster of her guns began 6,000 miles away in a Kansas snowfield 6 months earlier, when the Battle of Kansas demonstrated that the B-29 program was failing before it ever reached combat. General Henry Arnold, commanding officer of the Army Air Forces, had arrived at Smoky Hill Field in Salina on March 9, 1944, expecting to see the first wave of superfortresses departing for combat operations in India. Instead, he found incomplete modifications, malfunctioning systems, and bombers that couldn't maintain altitude above 20,000 feet due to overheating Wright R3350 engines. Arnold's famous temper erupted across the flight line. Boeing had accepted over $200 million to develop the most advanced bomber in history, then delivered aircraft so plagued with mechanical failures that ground crews joked about whether the engines would catch fire during taxi or after takeoff. The nickname for the R3350 became Wrong Engine, Wrong Time, a bitter assessment that killed more crew members through accidents and crashes than Japanese fighters managed during the first year of operations. The modifications required to make B-29 seconds combat ready continued even after aircraft reached operational theaters. Crews in India and China spent more time maintaining their temperamental bombers than flying combat missions. By July 1944, the in-commission rate hit 27%. 3/4 of the 20th Air Force's most expensive weapons system sat grounded, while mechanics struggled with cooling problems, fuel system failures, and fire control computers that rarely worked as advertised. The complexity of the General Electric defensive armament system exemplified everything wrong with the B-29's rushed development cycle. 5. Remotely controlled turrets, each operated by sophisticated analog computers that calculated lead angles based on target speed, aircraft velocity, temperature, humidity, and ballistic characteristics of 50 caliber ammunition. The system worked beautifully in theory and occasionally in practice. More often, electrical faults caused turrets to slew 20 degrees and spray their entire ammunition load in random directions, while gunners watched helplessly from their sighting stations. The 200-pound central fire control computers suffered from terrible build quality. Wiring harnesses developed shorts during high-altitude operations. Temperature variations caused relay switches to malfunction. 4 different companies had developed components independently, then cobbled them together into a single system without adequate testing. The result demanded constant maintenance that was impossible to provide under combat conditions. Turrets jammed. Computers failed. Ammunition feeds became unreliable at the precise moments when Japanese fighters pressed their attacks. The tactical results of this technological complexity became evident during Operation Matterhorn, the campaign to bomb Japan from bases in China supplied through India. Between June 1944 and January 1945, B-29 seconds of the 20th Bomber Command flew 72 missions across the most complicated logistics chain in military history. Each combat sortie required 6 cargo flights over the Himalayan hump just to position enough fuel and bombs at forward bases around Chengdu. The 8th trip would carry the ordnance for the actual strike against targets 1,500 miles away in Japan or Manchuria. General Kenneth Wolfe, the first commander of 20th Bomber Command, understood the logistical nightmare better than anyone. His headquarters at Kharagpur, 90 miles west of Calcutta, coordinated operations across 4 bases in Bengal while maintaining supply lines to 4 forward airfields around Chengdu, 1,000 miles northeast through some of the world's most hostile terrain. By May 1944, Wolfe had 160 B-29 seconds in India, but getting them combat-ready proved nearly impossible. The R-3350 engines continued their pattern of catastrophic failure. Crews discovered that Cairo's ambient temperature was too high for the engines to operate safely, forcing an entire wing to sit grounded for a week during their ferry flight from the United States. Once in India, the mechanical problems multiplied. Engines caught fire during taxi, fuel systems leaked, hydraulics failed. The complex electrical systems that controlled remotely operated turrets shorted out in tropical humidity that American engineers had never anticipated during Kansas testing. The first combat mission launched on June 5, 1944, against Japanese railroad facilities at Bangkok, Thailand, roughly 1,000 miles from Kharagpur. Of 98 bombers that took off, 77 hit their targets, dropping 368 tons of bombs with results that justified the effort, but hardly seemed worth the enormous investment of resources required to position the aircraft for a single strike against a secondary target. The first raid on Japan itself came 10 days later, when 68 B-29 seconds took off at night from staging bases at Chengdu to attack the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata on Kyushu, more than 1,500 miles away. This marked the first American bombing of the Japanese home islands since the Doolittle raid of April 1942. The symbolic importance exceeded the physical damage. Only 47 bombers hit the target area. 4 aborted with mechanical problems. 4 crashed during the mission. 6 jettisoned their bombs due to mechanical difficulties. Others bombed secondary targets or any opportunity they encountered rather than returning with payload intact. General Henry Arnold's impatience with Wolfe's progress led to his temporary replacement by Brigadier General Laverne Saunders until Major General Curtis LeMay could arrive from Europe to assume permanent command. The 3-week delay between the first and second Japan missions reflected operational realities that no amount of pressure from Washington could overcome. The logistics chain was simply too fragile to support sustained operations. Every gallon of fuel burned over Japan required 7 transport flights across the Himalayas just to position it at forward bases. Every bomb dropped on Japanese targets represented weeks of transport missions through weather conditions that killed more aircrew than Japanese fighters managed during the same period. The Air Transport Command eventually took over logistical support for the Chinese bases in late 1944, but adequate supplies never reached Chengdu in sufficient quantities to support sustained strategic bombing. The missions achieved limited strategic impact. High-altitude precision bombing from 30,000 feet encountered jet stream winds that carried bombs miles off target. Japanese defenses proved more effective than intelligence estimates had predicted. Mechanical failures forced countless aircraft to abort missions or divert to emergency landing fields. The investment of resources vastly exceeded the damage inflicted on Japanese war production. Among the 72 Matterhorn missions was the longest B-29 flight of the entire war, a 3,900-mile round trip to attack oil refineries at Palembang, Sumatra. The mission pushed aircraft and crews to their absolute limits, flying over hostile territory for hours, while hoping that engines wouldn't fail, fuel would last, and navigation calculations remained accurate enough to find both target and home base without comprehensive ground reference points. Several aircraft never returned. Others limped back on failing engines with fuel tanks, showing empty long before landing gear touched runway pavement. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Parker, commander of the 40th Bombardment Group, flew to England in early 1944 to gain combat experience with the 8th Air Force's B-17 operations over Germany. He lasted 2 missions. On March 6, 1944, his B-17 was shot down, and Parker spent the remainder of the war in a German prisoner camp. His B-29 group leadership position passed to other officers who would learn the same lessons about European combat doctrine not translating to Pacific operations. By November 1944, when B-29 seconds began operating from newly captured bases in the Marianas, the campaign's trajectory remained disappointing. The first raid against Tokyo on November 24th sent 111 Superfortresses against the Musashino aircraft factory. Results were negligible. Jet stream winds at altitude made accurate bombing impossible. Even incendiary weapons dropped. From 30,000 feet produced only scattered fires rather than the concentrated conflagrations that strategic planners had envisioned. General Haywood Hansell, commanding officer of 21st Bomber Command, adhered to the precision daylight bombing doctrine that had proven successful in Europe. His bombers flew in tight formation at high altitude, attacking specific industrial targets with general-purpose bombs. The approach worked poorly against Japanese cities where critical war production occurred in thousands of small workshops scattered throughout residential neighborhoods rather than concentrated in large factory complexes. Casualties mounted. Japanese fighters, though technologically inferior to American aircraft, exploited B-29 defensive vulnerabilities. The much-vaunted remote turret system failed repeatedly under combat stress. Kamikaze tactics introduced a new psychological factor that conventional defensive doctrine couldn't address. Pilots willing to die, guaranteed kills if they reached their targets, and complex fire control computers couldn't improve hit rates enough to stop determined attackers at long range. General Curtis LeMay arrived to replace Hansell in January 1945, bringing the aggressive tactical mindset that had transformed 8th Air Force bombing operations over Germany. But the situation in the Pacific demanded innovation rather than replication of European methods. LeMay spent 6 weeks attempting precision bombing with marginal results before concluding that the entire strategic approach needed fundamental revision. The answer came from analyzing Japanese urban geography and construction methods. American fire insurance companies had compiled detailed risk assessments of Tokyo's districts before the war, rating neighborhoods by their susceptibility to fires based on building density, structural materials, and firefighting resources. The data revealed that Tokyo was essentially kindling waiting for a match. Wood and paper construction dominated residential areas. Narrow streets prevented effective fire brigade access. High population density meant industrial workers lived adjacent to their workshops in conditions that would guarantee rapid fire spread. Test bombing trials conducted at Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah between May and September 1943 had demonstrated the effectiveness of incendiary weapons against Japanese-style construction. Engineers had built replica neighborhoods using authentic materials and architectural methods, then systematically burned them under controlled conditions to determine optimal attack patterns. The M69 incendiary bomb emerged as the ideal weapon, a 6-pound napalm device that exploded on impact, spraying jellied gasoline in 100-foot streams that ignited everything combustible within its radius. LeMay's plan for Tokyo violated every principle of strategic bombing doctrine that the Army Air Forces had developed over 3 years of European operations. Instead of high-altitude precision attacks in daylight, B-29 seconds would strike at night from altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. Instead of general-purpose bombs against specific targets, they would drop incendiaries in carpet patterns designed to create unstoppable firestorms. Instead of maintaining defensive formations with overlapping fields of fire, bombers would attack individually at intervals calculated to maintain continuous fire feeding. The weight calculations that made this plan feasible required stripping defensive armament to an extent that horrified experienced bomber crews. Each B-29 carried approximately 6,500 pounds of defensive systems in normal configuration, 5 turrets with mounting hardware, central fire control computers, ammunition feeds, electrical systems, and 3,500 to 5,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed across 10 gun positions. Removing everything except the tail, turret saved roughly 3,000 pounds per aircraft. That weight translated directly into additional bomb load or extended range at reduced altitude. Each bomber could carry 6 to 8 tons of M69 clusters instead of the standard load of 4 tons of general-purpose bombs. The increased payload would turn 300 aircraft into an incendiary delivery system capable of overwhelming Tokyo's firefighting capacity through sheer volume of simultaneous ignitions. The altitude reduction solved multiple problems simultaneously. Flying at 6,000 feet placed B-29 seconds below the jet stream that had made high-altitude bombing so ineffective. Navigation became simpler and more accurate. Bomb trajectories followed predictable ballistics, rather than being scattered by unpredictable high-altitude winds. Fuel consumption decreased significantly, extending effective range while carrying maximum payload. Most importantly, LeMay's intelligence analysis suggested that Japanese night fighter forces were relatively weak compared to their daylight capabilities. Tokyo's air defense system had been designed primarily to counter high-altitude daylight raids. Night operations would encounter fewer interceptors, and those that did respond would struggle to coordinate attacks against individual bombers scattered across the target area in darkness. But the entire plan rested on assumptions that could only be tested under combat conditions. If Japanese night fighters proved more capable than intelligence estimates suggested, 300 stripped bombers would face coordinated attacks while virtually defenseless. If anti-aircraft fire was heavier than predicted at medium altitude, losses could exceed 70%, the figure that LeMay's own intelligence officers had calculated as the worst-case scenario. LeMay notified 20th Air Force Headquarters of his intended tactics on March 8, choosing a day when General Arnold and his Chief of Staff would be absent. He later claimed he wanted to protect Arnold from blame if the mission failed catastrophically. The more likely explanation was that he suspected objections might follow if senior commanders had time to evaluate the plan's risk factors thoroughly before execution. The operational order issued to squadron commanders on March 8 used carefully chosen language that obscured the mission's revolutionary nature. Aircraft would conduct continuous patrols of target area through 0600 hours, March 10th. Primary objective area designated Zone 1 consisting of approximately 4 square miles of northeastern Tokyo with population density exceeding 1 million residents. Each bomber would carry 40 clusters of M69 incendiary bombs, roughly 1,500 individual weapons per aircraft. Pathfinder crews would mark the target with distinctive fire patterns, creating an X-shape centered on the most densely packed residential districts. Follow-on aircraft would simply aim for the flames, dropping their loads in widening circles that would create concentric rings of fire spreading outward from the initial ignition points. The pattern was designed to trap residents and firefighters in an ever-narrowing area of survival, while escape routes became blocked by advancing flames. Maintenance crews spent March 9th removing guns and ammunition from 334 B-29 seconds, scattered across 3 bases in the Marianas. The work proceeded with mechanical efficiency that contrasted sharply with the psychological turmoil afflicting many crew members. Gunners who had spent months training on complex fire control systems watched their primary weapons being unbolted from turret mounts and hauled away on trucks. The empty spaces left behind created visual reminders that the aircraft were going into battle in a deliberately weakened condition. Senior officers conducted mission briefings with carefully measured optimism that failed to completely mask underlying uncertainties. Pilots were told the mission profile would reduce exposure to enemy defenses. Bombardiers learned they would attack from altitudes where wind effects were negligible and visual identification was simple. Radio operators received instructions for maintaining communication while scattered across the target area. Tail gunners understood they represented the only defensive position, making their gunnery accuracy critical if Japanese fighters managed to press attacks from behind. What the briefings didn't emphasize was the essential gamble underlying the entire operation. LeMay was betting 300 aircraft and 3,000 crew members on intelligence estimates about enemy night capabilities that could only be verified by flying into Tokyo's defensive zone and discovering whether Japanese interceptors and anti-aircraft gunners could exploit the bomber's vulnerability. The takeoff sequence began at 17:36 hours, with Brigadier General Thomas Power leading the first Pathfinder B, 29 seconds into the early evening sky from Guam. The intervals between launches were carefully calculated to position aircraft over Tokyo in a continuous stream that would maintain maximum fire density throughout the attack. Bombers from Saipan and Tinian followed at predetermined times, the entire force converging on coordinates that marked the heart of Tokyo's most flammable neighborhoods. Staff Sergeant Carl Barthold's Star Duster lifted off from Saipan and joined the stream of bombers flying northwest toward Japan. The formation, such as it was, consisted of individual aircraft maintaining altitude separation while following the same navigation waypoints. There would be no defensive boxes, no coordinated mutual support, no overlapping fields of fire from multiple bombers. Each crew was essentially alone in the darkness, trusting that Japanese night defenses would be as weak as intelligence suggested. The flight lasted 7 hours across empty ocean marked only by occasional navigation stars visible between cloud layers. Interior heaters maintained cabin temperature, while crew members monitored instruments and conducted systems checks with the routine precision of men who knew their survival depended on equipment reliability. The stripped armament created unsettling empty spaces in the fuselage, where gun turrets had previously provided psychological reassurance, even when not actively engaged. As Starduster approached the Japanese coast, radio chatter increased with Pathfinder reports confirming clear weather over the target area. Wind speeds were moderate, gusting between 17 and 28 miles per hour from the northwest. Perfect conditions for driving flames through the densely packed wooden structures of Zone 1. Surface temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with relative humidity at 45%, dry enough to ensure rapid-fire spread once ignitions reached critical density. The first B-29 seconds reached Tokyo shortly after. Midnight on March 10th, Pathfinder bombardiers released their incendiary clusters in precise patterns that created the distinctive X shape visible from 40 miles away. The flames marked the aiming point for follow-on aircraft with brutal simplicity. Subsequent bombers simply flew toward the fires and released their loads in expanding rings that guaranteed comprehensive coverage of the target district. Staff Sergeant Barthold experienced the attack from his radio operator's position, monitoring communications, while the bombardier worked the final approach to release point. The aircraft flew straight and level at 7,800 feet, low enough that Barthold could smell burning wood and paper through air vents that admitted outside atmosphere. The odor was unlike anything he had encountered during training or previous missions, a nauseating combination of burning structures and incinerated organic matter that permeated the unpressurized sections of the fuselage. The tail gunner called out fires visible below, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and horror as the scale of destruction became apparent. Individual blazes that had seemed distinct from altitude merged into a general conflagration covering multiple square miles. Smoke rose to 10,000 feet, forcing many bombers to climb above the thermal updrafts that threatened to flip aircraft inverted if they encountered the strongest convection currents rising from the inferno below. Japanese anti-aircraft fire proved lighter than expected. A few searchlight batteries attempted to track individual bombers, but the smoke and flames created conditions that made visual acquisition nearly impossible. Flak bursts appeared sporadically, their timing and altitude suggesting that gunners were firing blind rather than tracking specific targets. The medium-altitude attack profile that had seemed so risky during mission planning turned out to provide significant defensive advantages as smoke obscured the cottis, bombers from ground observation. Night fighter opposition materialized in isolated encounters rather than coordinated attacks. A few Japanese interceptors managed to find individual B-29 seconds in the darkness, pressing attacks from angles that the stripped bombers couldn't defend effectively. 27 B-29 seconds were shot down during the mission, some by fighters, others by anti-aircraft fire. A handful caught in massive updrafts that exceeded their structural limits. But the loss rate of 8% fell far below the 70% worst-case projection that had haunted pre-mission planning discussions. The effectiveness of the attack exceeded even optimistic predictions. 282 bombers reached the target area and dropped nearly 16 square miles worth of Zone 1, was destroyed in 6 hours of continuous bombing. Approximately 100,000 people died, most from asphyxiation or burning. Others trampled in panicked evacuation attempts through streets that became blocked by collapsing structures and advancing flames. More than 1 million residents lost their homes as the conflagration spread beyond its intended boundaries. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Brigadier General Power landed at Guam's North Field after 15 hours and 4 minutes in the air, his eyes carrying dark circles that testified to the psychological weight of commanding history's most destructive air raid. He reported to LeMay that anti-aircraft fire had been lighter than expected, Japanese night fighters had not posed significant opposition, and the fires in Tokyo had combined into a single vast conflagration visible from 100 miles away. 3 B-29 seconds had ditched in the ocean during return flights, their crews rescued by submarine picket boats positioned along the route. The strategic implications became clear within hours, as reconnaissance revealed the extent of destruction. Tokyo's industrial output had been cut in half by eliminating the thousands of small workshops that supplied larger factories with components and finished goods. Japanese civil defense had proven completely inadequate to handle fires on this scale. Water pressure in hydrant systems had failed within 30 minutes of the attack's start. Firefighting personnel had been overwhelmed by simultaneous ignitions across too wide an area to contain with available resources. The success vindicated LeMay's calculations about weight, range, payload, and enemy defensive capabilities. But the human cost weighed on many crew members, who had smelled Tokyo burning through their aircraft's ventilation systems. Flight Surgeon Major Tom Wilson documented 12 requests for squadron transfers within 72 hours. Several pilots reported persistent nightmares. Others began drinking heavily during off-duty hours, seeking chemical relief from memories of methodical destruction that bore no resemblance to the precision bombing doctrine they had trained to execute. The removal of defensive armament became standard procedure for subsequent incendiary raids against Japanese cities. Between March 10 and August 15, 1945, B-29 seconds conducted systematic firebombing that destroyed or heavily damaged 67 urban areas. The stripped configuration that had seemed so risky during the first Tokyo mission proved effective across the campaign. Japanese night defenses never adapted to counter the tactics, and loss rates remained below 10% even as raids continued with relentless frequency. The weight savings that allowed this campaign also contributed to other operational innovations. Stripped B-29 seconds flying from Iwo Jima could reach targets throughout Japan while carrying maximum bomb loads. The 500-mile range extension created by reducing weight meant aircraft could loiter over target areas for extended periods or divert to alternate objectives without facing fuel shortage emergencies. Maintenance requirements decreased as complex fire control systems no longer needed constant servicing. By the war's end, the systematic removal of defensive armament had become accepted doctrine for night incendiary operations. The B-29B variant entered production in February 1945, with no gun turrets installed except for the tail position, eliminating the weight of turret mounting hardware, central fire control computers, and electrical systems that had never worked reliably under combat conditions. The production variant acknowledged what combat experience had proven against enemies who lacked effective night fighter forces. Defensive guns represented expensive weight that could be better allocated to offensive payload. The mathematical logic that drove this decision reflected broader changes in strategic bombing philosophy during the final year of the Pacific War. Precision had given way to area effect. Daylight operations had shifted to darkness. High altitude had become low level. Complex defensive systems had been abandoned in favor of simplicity and reliability. Each change represented adaptation to specific enemy capabilities, rather than adherence to doctrine developed in different theaters against different opponents. The Boeing Company's marketing materials had emphasized the B-29's revolutionary defensive armament as a key selling point to military planners. The remote-controlled turrets, sophisticated fire control computers, and centralized gunner positions were supposed to represent the future of bomber defense. But combat revealed that technological sophistication was worthless if systems failed under operational stress. Reliability mattered more than innovation when crew survival depended on equipment functioning perfectly under the worst conditions imaginable. The lesson extended beyond defensive systems to overall aircraft design philosophy. The B-29 had been designed as an all-altitude, all-weather, heavily defended strategic bomber capable of fighting its way to any target regardless of enemy opposition. Combat experience demonstrated that no aircraft could be optimized for every possible mission profile. Specific tactics required specific configurations. Flexibility meant the ability to adapt hardware to mission requirements rather than forcing missions to accommodate hardware limitations. Major Edward Larner, whose skip bombing modifications had revolutionized anti-shipping warfare in the Southwest Pacific, understood this principle intuitively. His 8-gun nose installations on B-25 Mitchell bombers had violated conventional design wisdom by removing bombardier positions to make room for forward-firing weapons. But the modifications worked because they matched specific tactical requirements rather than attempting to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. LeMay's decision to strip defensive armament followed similar logic. The mission was night incendiary attack against cities with weak night fighter defenses. Defensive guns added weight without proportional defensive value under these specific conditions. Therefore, remove the guns and use the weight savings to increase offensive payload. The reasoning was simple once freed from doctrine that treated defensive armament as sacrosanct regardless of tactical context. The psychological impact on gunners whose positions were eliminated proved more complex than strategic calculations suggested. These men had trained for months to operate sophisticated weapons systems that represented the cutting edge of military technology. Their professional identity was tied to mastery of equipment that distinguished B-29 operations from previous bomber operations. Removing that equipment felt like a statement that their skills and training were worthless, that the Air Force considered them expendable weight rather than essential crew members. Some gunners requested transfers to positions where their training remained relevant. Others adapted to new roles within the modified crew structure, taking on additional responsibilities for navigation, communication, or systems monitoring. A few simply accepted the reality that warfare was constantly evolving and that yesterday's essential specialization might become today's unnecessary complexity. But the emotional cost of watching their primary weapons being removed from aircraft carried psychological weight that mission briefings and post-mission debriefings rarely acknowledged. The broader strategic context made these individual sacrifices comprehensible, if not comfortable. By March 1945, intelligence estimates suggested that invading Japan would cost 500,000 to 1 million American casualties. Every day the war continued meant additional deaths from ongoing military operations throughout the Pacific. Anything that might shorten the conflict by weeks or months represented acceptable risk, even if it demanded abandoning conventional defensive doctrine. The firebombing campaign's effectiveness contributed to Japan's eventual surrender by destroying the industrial capacity that sustained military operations. Roughly 40% of urban areas had been devastated by August. 8 million people were homeless. War production had collapsed to a fraction of 1944 levels. The psychological impact of sustained bombing created conditions where even military leadership recognized that continued resistance was futile. Whether this outcome justified the means remained debatable decades after the war ended. The Tokyo raid on March 10 killed more people in 6 hours than any other conventional attack in military history. The systematic burning of 67 cities killed between 250,000 and 330,000 civilians, while leaving millions homeless. Robert McNamara, who served as a statistical analyst for the dated Strategic Bombing Campaign, later observed that if America had lost the war, he and LeMay would likely have been prosecuted as war criminals for their roles in the incendiary attacks. LeMay himself acknowledged this possibility, telling McNamara that the morality of their actions would be judged by history based on whether they won or lost. Winners could justify strategic bombing as necessary to end the war quickly and save lives that an invasion would have cost. Losers would face trial for deliberately targeting civilian populations with weapons designed to cause maximum casualties, regardless of military necessity. The aircraft that carried out these missions bore none of the moral weight that burdened their crews. The B-29 was simply a platform for delivering explosive payload from one location to another. Its design included sophisticated defensive systems, because planners assumed heavy bomber operations would face opposition similar to what had been encountered over Germany. When Pacific combat revealed different threat environments, the aircraft adapted through modifications that optimized performance for actual conditions rather than hypothetical scenarios. The stripped B-29 seconds that burned Tokyo in March 1945 represented the culmination of 3 years of adaptation between initial design specifications and combat reality. They were lighter, simpler, more reliable, and more effective than the heavily armed defensive fortresses that Boeing engineers had envisioned in 1941. The evolution demonstrated that successful weapons design required willingness to abandon cherished concepts when battlefield evidence contradicted theoretical assumptions. Staff Sergeant Carl Barthold flew 23 more missions after the March 10 Tokyo raid, each one in a progressively more stripped-down configuration, as commanders identified additional weight savings that improved performance. The final missions removed everything, not absolutely essential, for navigation, bombing, and return flight. The aircraft became essentially a flying fuel tank wrapped around a bomb bay, optimized for a single purpose, delivering incendiary weapons to Japanese cities with maximum efficiency and minimum weight penalty. The psychological transformation paralleled the physical modifications. Crews who had initially felt vulnerable and exposed in stripped aircraft gradually accepted that defensive guns provided more psychological comfort than tactical advantage against enemies who rarely pressed coordinated attacks. The absence of complex systems meant fewer mechanical failures. Lighter weight meant better performance, easier handling, and reduced fuel consumption. The mission completion rate improved as aircraft became simpler and more reliable. By August 1945, when atomic weapons provided a new method of strategic devastation, the conventional firebombing campaign had already achieved its objective of destroying Japan's capacity to sustain war. The stripped B-29 seconds that had seemed so controversial in March had proven their value through 45,000 sorties that delivered 161,000 tons of incendiary bombs while maintaining loss rates, below what conventional defensive doctrine would have achieved. The lesson transcended specific tactical applications to illuminate broader truths about military innovation. Organizations naturally resist abandoning established methods, even when evidence suggests alternatives might work better. Conventional wisdom becomes institutionalized through training, doctrine, and equipment design. Breaking free from these patterns requires commanders willing to risk career consequences for implementing unproven concepts that violate accepted practice. LeMay risked exactly this when he ordered defensive armament removed without explicit approval from higher headquarters. If the Tokyo mission had failed catastrophically, his career would have ended in disgrace and Khamenei, possible court-martial, for recklessly endangering 3,000 crew members through unauthorized deviation from approved tactics. The success that vindicated his calculations also protected him from consequences that would have followed failure. The weight calculations that made the mission possible were ultimately simple mathematics. 3,000 pounds of defensive equipment traded for 3,000 pounds of additional bombs or 500 miles of extended range. But implementing that trade required abandoning psychological comfort that gunners derived from complex weapon systems and accepting vulnerability that felt wrong to crews trained in conventional defensive doctrine. The courage to make this trade came from understanding enemy capabilities well enough to predict their responses with reasonable accuracy. LeMay's intelligence analysts had studied Japanese night fighter forces and concluded they lacked the training, equipment, and coordination to mount effective opposition to medium-altitude attacks in darkness. That assessment proved correct not through luck, but through systematic analysis of enemy performance during previous missions. The stripped aircraft that flew to Tokyo on March 10th represented the physical embodiment of calculated risk based on superior intelligence. They were vulnerable in ways that violated every instinct bomber crews had developed during training. But they were effective precisely because they adapted to specific tactical circumstances rather than following universal defensive doctrine that didn't account for enemy weakness. The broader implication suggested that military effectiveness often required accepting vulnerability in areas where enemies couldn't exploit it in order to concentrate resources where they produced maximum effect. This was counterintuitive to institutional cultures that valued comprehensive protection against all possible threats. But comprehensive protection was impossible at weight and cost, limits that real aircraft had to meet. Choices were inevitable. The question was whether those choices would be driven by doctrine or by tactical reality. The specific numbers told a story that doctrine-bound thinking couldn't accommodate. A standard B-29 inches defensive configuration carried approximately 1350 caliber Browning M2 machine guns distributed across 5 turret positions. 4 guns in the forward dorsal turret, 2 each in the aft dorsal, forward ventral, and aft ventral positions, plus 2 in the tail turret alongside a single 20mm cannon. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. The turret mounting hardware, electrical systems, ammunition feeds, and central fire control computers added roughly 2,000 pounds. Ammunition loads varied by mission profile, but standard combat loading included 3,500 to 5,000 rounds, distributed to provide sustained fire capability. The mathematics were simple, but their implications revolutionary. Each 1,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition weighed 350 pounds. Full combat loading of 5,000 rounds meant 1,750 pounds of ammunition alone. Add the gun weight, turret systems, computers, and electrical infrastructure, and total defensive equipment exceeded 6,500 pounds on a fully loaded aircraft. Removing everything except the tail turret eliminated approximately 3,000 pounds of weight that could be reallocated to offensive payload. 3,000 pounds translated to 12 additional clusters of M69 incendiary bombs. Each cluster contained 38 individual 6-pound napalm devices. 12 clusters meant 456 additional incendiary weapons per aircraft. Multiply that across 334 bombers, and the raid delivered over 150,000 additional firebombs compared to what could have been carried in defensive configuration. Alternatively, the weight savings extended effective combat radius by approximately 500 miles at medium altitude. This meant B-29 seconds based in the Marianas could reach targets throughout the Japanese home islands while maintaining adequate fuel reserves for return flight and possible diversions. The operational flexibility this created was as valuable as the increased payload capacity. allowing mission planners to consider targets that would have been impossible under previous weight constraints. The engineering principles behind these calculations dated to the earliest days of aviation, when designers learned that every pound of weight imposed penalties throughout aircraft performance. But translating theoretical understanding into operational doctrine required commanders willing to challenge assumptions about what constituted necessary equipment. Defensive armament had always been considered essential for bomber operations. The concept of deliberately removing guns seemed like surrendering to enemy forces before combat even began. LeMay's genius lay in recognizing that necessity was contextual rather than absolute. Against German fighters over Europe, where Luftwaffe pilots were skilled, well-equipped, and numerous, comprehensive defensive armament was genuinely necessary. B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds needed every gun they carried to have any chance of surviving missions deep into German territory. The defensive formations that bomber commanders developed during the European campaign worked specifically because overlapping fields of fire from multiple aircraft created deadly zones that German fighters had to penetrate at extreme risk. But Japanese night fighter forces in March 1945 bore no resemblance to the Luftwaffe at its peak. Training programs had been disrupted by fuel shortages. Equipment quality had declined as experienced mechanics and technicians were pulled into other assignments. Coordination between ground control and airborne interceptors remained primitive compared to German capabilities. Most critically, Japanese doctrine emphasized daylight interception of high-altitude bombers rather than night operations against medium-altitude targets. The intelligence analysis that informed LeMay's decision examined every available source of information about Japanese air defense capabilities. Intercepted communications revealed training deficiencies and equipment shortages. Photo reconnaissance documented the number and types of fighter aircraft stationed near Tokyo. Debriefings of B-29 crews from previous missions provided tactical intelligence about engagement patterns and enemy attack techniques. The composite picture suggested night fighter opposition would be limited and poorly coordinated. This assessment carried enormous weight because it determined whether 3,000 American aircrew lived or died on a single mission. Intelligence officers who signed off on the evaluation understood they were betting lives on analysis that could only be verified through combat. If their assessment proved wrong, if Japanese night capabilities exceeded estimates, the mission would become a massacre that would end careers and possibly lead to courts-martial for commanders who approved such a risky approach. The B-29 crews who flew missions in March 1945 made their choices based on tactical reality that trumped comfortable doctrine. They stripped their aircraft of defensive systems and flew into enemy territory, while deliberately vulnerable, because mathematics indicated this approach would work better than maintaining illusory security through defensive weapons that added weight without proportional value. Their success validated the mathematics and established precedent for future operations. But the psychological cost of flying deliberately weakened aircraft into combat remained real for crew members who bore the immediate risk of decisions made by commanders who stayed safely on the ground while their orders were executed over hostile territory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.